the 2008 International Sportsmen's Exposition.
Welcome, ladies and gentlemen. My talk today, if you looked at the list over there, it's labeled junk fishing. The reason I use this as a topic for my discussion is I think it's important for a lot of beginning bass fishermen in general, to really try to keep in mind that versatility is really important throughout the day. Any place you're at on the water, you really need to be able to be comfortable with a various number of different baits, different techniques, and always be open-minded as far as what the conditions are going to dictate throughout that given fishing day, and the different things you might be able to do to exploit all of the fishing opportunities that are given to you. So what I've basically done is I've kind of narrowed down my box to the general types of baits that I will usually have on the deck of my boat on any given fishing days, so that I can start kind of feeling out the water, what the fish are doing, what kind of things I can really use to catch more fish than, say, the other average anglers out there with me that day. So some of the baits here, they're a little goofy looking. This right here is a chatterbait, and I like to put one of the Bass Tricks minnows, or now Berkeley's coming out with a hollow body tube swim bait. Basically, it just gives it a real big profile. A lot of guys like to throw spinner baits and things to cover water. A chatterbait is real similar to a spinner bait, where it's a vibrating bait that gives off a lot of vibration in the water, and you can fish it pretty quickly. And when I add the swim bait tail to it, it just gives it a little bit different profile. It's just something that the fish maybe haven't seen too often. And the way you fish this bait is a lot like a spinnerbait or a crankbait. You can slow roll it. You can also jig it off the bottom like a regular jigging pork or jigging plastic. But it just gives a real nice large profile. You can see that tail kind of kicking along. It's something that I'll usually have tied on about year round, but I really like this in the spring when the fish are pretty aggressive. They're starting to feed up toward the spawn. This is something that I use fairly often. I like to throw it on a heavy rod and heavy 17 to 20 pound fluorocarbon to really be able to horse fish out. But this is something that I'm going to use to cover a lot of water. Like I say, I'm just going to be going down the bank. I'm going to usually try to start somewhere that has a fairly large area. I'm really familiar with the Delta. I really like fishing Frank's Track, Big Break, Sherman Lake, places like that on the Delta, where it's large, expansive, open water areas that have a lot of subtle contours and tule points, things like that inside of it. And what I'll do is I'll usually pull up to a spot, throw the trolling motor down, and like I said, I'll have about 4 or 5 different rods out at least on my deck. And what I'm going to do is I'm just going to start firing at different structure elements throughout that area that I'm fishing. A lot of times I'll throw something like this first around a tule point, make a couple casts. If that doesn't work, before I leave that spot, I'll pick up another bait that I have a lot of confidence in, something like a rattling bait. This is actually the bait that I won the tournament on last year at the Delta. It's nothing special. It's just a rattling vibe, Yozuri, basically like a rattle trap style bait. Before I leave a given spot, I'll usually make a few casts with this. But I fish it a little bit differently than a lot of guys do, or it's not as common anyway. What I'll usually do with this bait, although it has treble hooks on it, I'll let it sink down to the bottom, whether it's in grass or open water, and I'll give it a good rip to get it started, and I'll kind of give it a pumping action and just almost work it like you can imagine ripping a spoon off the bottom or something like that. I'm just going to use this to try to activate some fish. It's got really loud rattles in it, and so usually the fish will hear it before they see it, and it'll get them kind of fired up. A lot of times I'll notice too, if I pull up to an area, make a few casts, say with the chatterbait or another type of bait, don't get a bite, I'll throw this out, and after a few casts of hearing this thing down in the water, those fish will start hearing that rattling sound. And I've noticed more times than not, after 5 or 10 casts, all of a sudden you get a fish fired up, you'll catch one, then all of a sudden you catch another one. Rattle style baits are really good at actually catching numbers of fish, because once they get keyed in on that sound, I think it's a lot of a competitive nature of the fish that they're going to want to go out and find that rattling thing and just slam it. this bait is phenomenal, especially on weedy areas, like I said, in the Delta. It comes through grass really well. You can fish it fast, but it's really, really deadly, just kind of with this pumping motion. A lot of times what I'm trying to do is feel for this bait to just get caught up in the grass ever so slightly and rip it out. A lot of people talk about ticking the grass with a rattle trap, if you've heard that expression. What they're talking about is usually they're reeling the bait to where they'll feel the grass and they'll pop it out. But the bait's constantly moving, and like I said, I like to actually just get, instead of a steady retrieve, I like to just let the bait settle on the bottom and just give it subtle jerks up, just so I can feel the first 5 or 6 rattles of the bait, and then let it fall back down. And a lot of times the fish will actually pick it up when it's sinking. So it'll feel a lot like a worm or a jig bite, just a subtle thump, and you'll set the hook. And with the treble hooks on a rattle style bait, you really get a really good percentage of hookups. I like to throw it on a medium heavy action kind of parabolic rod, so that when I do set the hook, I'm not really setting the hooks really hard, because with the treble hooks, anytime you really set the hook hard, you have a good chance of ripping that little hook out of the fish's mouth. What I just want to do is just reel down and just give a solid pull back and keep reeling. And a lot of times that'll seat the treble hooks into the fish's mouth, and from that point you can just fight the fish to the boat and bring it in. Another bait that I've been growing more and more confident with over the last couple of years is swim bait. And I know Bob just gave a really good talk on swim baits. I'm going to use this as a search bait when I know the fish are shallow. Personally, I'm not very much of a big open water structured type fisherman like Bub was talking about, fishing on big expansive points and whatnot. What I'm going to try to use this bait as is the bait fish that's just scurrying about the cover, and I'm trying to pick off those fish that are sitting in an ambush point. So, for example, there'll be a pocket in a tule berm, and there'll be 2 little points on each side of the pocket, and I'm envisioning a fish sitting on either one of those tule points, waiting for something to either come along the points or out from the inside of that pocket. So I'll pitch this bait up shallow into the shallow water and just slow roll it back, a lot like a spinner bait. This bait specifically is a bait smith. It's very similar to a Huddleston style. It's got a boot tail, but this is the rate of fall 0, so it stays really shallow on areas that have a lot of grass like the Delta. It's real easy to work through the grass. Doesn't get hung up very much. It's got one single hook on the top, so you don't have to worry too much about treble hooks hanging up. There is an area at the bottom where I put a split ring, so if I'm noticing that I'm missing some fish, or it's not quite as dirty a bottom as other places are, I can put a treble hook down there if I want. If I do, I always put a red treble hook on. It's just a confidence thing for me. I feel like the red hook gives it something to really key in on. But this is something else I'm going to have on my deck all spring and throughout the summer. I've caught fish on this bait on days when I wouldn't necessarily expect, so it's really helped me build confidence in a swim bait. I've caught fish on this really dead calm, sunny bluebird days in the middle of the summer. A lot like when you might want to throw topwater bait like a frog or something like that. But this bait is really, really deadly. It's a little bit smaller profile than the Huddlestons. I personally don't have that much confidence with the really big baits. I know a lot of fish get caught on them, but when I put a bait on that's about 5 or 6 inches long, I just feel like any fish in the pond is going to be able to eat that. I'm going to get a good hookup, put the fish in the boat. So this is another bait that I'm really going to key in on in the springtime. When I start talking about soft plastic and search style baits, I'm still kind of covering water. I'm trying to figure out what the fish are doing. Maybe I haven't gotten any bites on the reaction baits. Maybe a follower or 2 on the swim bait. I know fish are in the area, but I haven't really caught any fish yet. A bait that I've grown to love is just a wacky worm, little Berkeley wacky crawler. It's just a 5-inch straight tail worm, zoom trick worm, very similar. What I do is I take a little nail weight. They come in a variety of different sizes, but the ones that I really like, I think I brought some. There's 3 32nds, and then there's a smaller size. I want to say it's 1/64 or something like that. Really small little pencil lead. And what I do is I break about half of it off and stick it in the front of the worm. So if you can't really see this, but it's about a 1/4 inch long and maybe the size of a pencil lead. I'll break that off, stick it in the nose of the worm, and what this is going to do, I rig it wacky, so I'm about in the middle of the worm, and this bait's going to fall with a really head down attitude. It's going to fall straight down, and it's going to kind of sit at the bottom, and when I shake it, the tail should come off the bottom, but the whole worm doesn't really have to travel very far. And you can just shake this on a slack line, and it just scurries along, keeps a very straight attitude in the water, and it's very, very deadly bait. I've caught a lot of really large fish on a little bitty worm like this. The key to this, though, is you really have to be patient. You're not going to be throwing this with the trolling motor down on 100. You really have to kind of slow down for a minute. You have to make a cast and let the bait settle, and you just want to shake it like you'd shake a drop shot or a shaky head worm. Just really, really subtle little movements, and this bait is really, really good, especially in the spring. Again, spring and pre-spawn time when the fish are moving around. They're a little bit spooky. A lot of times in the Delta, especially in Frank's Track, it gets a lot of fishing pressure, and a lot of people are fishing shallow, and everybody's throwing a drop shot or everybody's throwing a swim bait, and the fish see that over and over and over again, and I can go in behind those people and throw this little worm around, and a lot of times I'll get bit by the fish that have either followed a swim bait or just saw 10 other baits go by, and they'll see this, and I believe there's been a couple fish that have just nosed down to look at this bait today. It's the kind of bait that an inactive fish will be very apt to bite. So it's something that I'm always going to have on the deck. It also works extremely well in spotted bass fisheries like Shasta, Oroville, Lake Folsom. It's something that spotted bass really like. If I'm fishing it deeper than, say, 4 or 5 feet, I'll put the whole nail weight in it, or I'll go up a size and use the thicker nail weight and break off maybe half of it. It all kind of depends on how fast you feel like you need to move the bait. But usually what I'll do is I'll start light and I'll move heavier, and because I have more confidence in a lighter bait and it looks more natural in the water. Usually when I'm throwing this, personal preference, I'm throwing either a watermelon seed or a green pumpkin, something very natural, very crawdad looking, green and brown. For spotted bass, I've done really well with shad colored worms, but for the most part I really stick with a green or watermelon, which has a little bit of chartreuse color in it. There's also another bait I'm going to tie on real quick that's getting really popular out here that works great as a search bait too, and I think it's a little bit contrary to what a lot of guys think about this new bait. The new FLW magazine wrote up an article about it. They called it Flick Shake, and they have a whole series of jig heads and things that go along with it. But basically all it is, it's a mini ball head jig head. It's got a small tungsten jig head attached to it, and the hook kind of looks more like a worm hook. It's specifically designed for this type of attitude for the bait. And what you want to do with this is it's basically the same idea as the last one, only I'm shaking this one within the water column. I'm not necessarily trying to get this bait down to the bottom. I want to just keep this bait moving, and what that little jig head allows is kind of that rocking motion. If you can see that, it's almost like a drop shot worm shaking, only there's no drop shot weight. You can work this really well through suspended areas or where fish are expected to be suspended. You see them on the graph. It's just something that they're not used to seeing. It's just a really subtle shaking worm. Again, I really like this with the dark colors as well. I think it just gives a little bit more of a presence in the water. But this is something that I'll use on the Delta per se, with a spinning rod, 8-pound, maybe 10-pound at the max, but I really like to throw it on 6 or 8. This is something else that I'm going to fish in those open water areas like Frank's Track, Sherman Lake, Big Break. I'm going to throw this out along the weed lines, and I'm going to try to fish this right along the edge of the grass, areas where current's rolling through, places where I expect fish to be staging, and if I can't get them to bite the reaction baits easily, I'm going to go to something like this where I can cover a little bit more water with, because this is something that I can keep moving. I don't have to have it sitting on the bottom. It works well while it's in motion throughout the water column. So this is something else that I'm really going to, use a lot, especially in areas that are heavily pressured. Over the last few years, Frank's track, I don't know if many of you are familiar with Frank's track on the Delta, but it has really gotten hammered because the secret's basically out on how productive that body of water is on the Delta. Anytime between, end of February through May and into July, June and July, that place gets hammered, and there are hundreds of fish caught out of Frank's track every day by the dozens of boats that are out there, and you really need to try to find something a little bit different, and a lot of times I can go through those areas with a fast bait like a rattle trap and catch fish, but in a tournament situation, or if I'm spending the weekend fishing a couple days in a row, I'm going to notice that once I find an active area, school of fish with a bait like a rattle trap, the next day they're going to get a little bit wise to it. And if you don't, you might try to change a color, you might try to change size. If things like that aren't still working, you just need to realize that those fish are still in those areas, but you need to constantly be trying something new. So that's why it's important to have a good number of different baits on the deck, ready to go at a moment's notice. So that if you come up to a two-leaf clump, you want to throw your swim bait, you throw the swim bait. You can pick something else up, give it a couple other tries. Another bait that I've been using for years now, and it's just getting to the point where a lot of guys are doing it, is flipping a heavy weight. And I don't know if you watch some of the TV shows, and the guys are out there punching mats, flipping through really heavy hyacinth, blowing over tules, plump matted grass. They're using these 1 ounce to 1.5 ounce. In some cases, they make 1 3/4, 2 ounce tungsten bullet weights. And what this does is it falls extremely fast to the bottom. Anytime I'm going down the bank and I'm throwing a rattle trap, or I'm throwing a spinnerbait, or I'm throwing my chatterbait, and I see a little clump of blown over grass, a wad of water hyacinth that basically looks like floating plants, laid over tules, anything really nasty looking, blown in, broken up grass that'll blow up onto a tule berm, I'm going to take this really heavy weight, it's going to look kind of goofy, but I flip it way up high and let the bait fall onto the cover itself, into the thickest part of what I see floating on the surface. I'm hoping that there's about 1.5 to 4 foot of water underneath, and the reason I'm going to swing it way up and let it fall is I want to get it started to go through that grass, through that vegetation. The heavy weight's going to bring it down really fast, and a lot of times the strike's going to occur when this bait actually breaks through the vegetation and is on its way plummeting down. So when you do this, it's important to not try to mend your line and let it fall slow. You really want it to go in and just fall really fast as you can let it fall. When I'm doing this, I'm not going to fish any less than 65-pound braid. Sometimes I'm going to go up to 80. A really stout straight shank hook and a heavy weight. 1 ounce to 1.5 ounce works. This is one of those kind of techniques, though. It's a little bit like swim baiting, where you might spend all day flipping and not get a bite. But once you figure out, if you have confidence in it, every time you pass that little clump of structure, that little clump of vegetation, you're just going to give it a couple flips, let that thing fall through real fast, pop it off the bottom a couple times, reel in, do it again. You're going to really be surprised if you spend some time with this technique, how many fish you'll catch that you would have not catch otherwise, because they're literally living underneath the vegetation. And it's not the kind of thing where you can throw a crankbait up next to it and the fish will come out. But as soon as you put it right in their kitchen, they're just going to hammer it. Real important thing with this technique is, like I said, number one, the heavy line, because you're bringing the fish out of basically snags and cover. You also need a really, really heavy rod. This is an 8-foot flipping stick. And again, the really heavy weight. You kind of have to start with it pegged to get a feel for it, or else you're going to have a lot of trouble getting snagged and whatnot. I've gotten to the point where I'm real comfortable without a pegged weight, and I feel like I get a few more bites because maybe the action's a little different. But I recommend starting with a pegged weight and then working your way to where you're comfortable with it. It feels really heavy at first because you are flipping 1 ounce to 1.5 ounces. But once you get the hang of it, it's really, really deadly. All throughout the year, I've caught fish on this. Pre-spawn, spawn, throughout the summer months is really good when the fish are trying to hide from the sun. I've also caught fish on this in really, really cold weather when, there'll be a bank where you've been catching a lot of fish, or say you have in the past. You show up there during the wintertime, and you sometimes, especially on the Delta after a storm, big clumps of broken up grass will blow up onto certain banks downwind. And you'll go to that bank and you'll see a big clump of stuff floating where you've never seen that kind of broken up grass or hyacinth. And you'd be amazed how many fish will just levitate to those areas because it's something different. They can get out from under the sun in the cold weather. The decaying grass and vegetation kind of actually adds a little bit of layer of heat to the water. It can actually warm up the areas. So I'm going to go through a couple of the other baits that I'm going to throw. On the Delta, specifically, rattle trap is really, really hard to beat, but there's another bait that is probably equally as deadly, and that's a little speed trap made by Lure Jensen. It's a little 1/4 ounce. This is the 1/4 ounce version, and they make one a little bit larger. Either size is good. This is a really tight wobbling bait, a lot like the rattle trap, only it's got a bill on it, so it floats. So you're not going to be able to let this bait sink to the bottom. I'm just going to use this more to try to feel for the grass, and when I do feel the grass, I'll give it a little rip, pop it out of the grass. The square bill nature of this bait comes through vegetation really, really well. So this is something else I'm going to try. There's also another lure that, and it's about the only spinnerbait that I throw because I'm just not really that spinnerbaits, but for some reason this bright orange color is a great bait to search for fish with. I've had a lot of success throwing this just to find some active fish. It seems like, to me, the color is very uncommon, so the fish don't see it very often, but then it has the same vibrations that they do like in other spinnerbaits. This is something that I'll throw a lot, especially if the water gets a little bit stained up. Orange spinnerbait. It's unbelievable bait. Looks a little goofy, but you really got to give it a try. I've had a lot of success on this with spotted bass as well. Spotted bass are notorious for liking, say, colors like white on white and chartreuse on chartreuse. Well, this is just another solid color pattern that works really well for spotted bass. And again, I'm gonna target edges, points, pockets, things like little irregularities in the cover that I'm fishing. Another aspect to junk fishing that I'm going to relate a little bit more to the Delta is how you'll approach different areas on the tide and the tide changes. The tide on the Delta, as most of you know if you fish there, fluctuates high, low every 6 hours. The difference is being that at high tide there obviously is more water, low tide there's less water. I'm going to approach those different tides in a little bit different way to try to find fish. If I'm fishing a low tide, to me, I've been more successful trying to target open areas in the grass at low tide because the way I look at it, the fish on a high tide will be all spread out and they have a lot more water to use. When the tide starts to drop out, those fish will move to the edges of the vegetation, the edges of the structure, because that's their last resort for deep water, and a lot of the shallow water bait and things that they're feeding on has been pulled out with the current. So they're going to not only follow the bait out towards where the water is running, which is the deepest areas, like say in Frank's track, the bait's going to get pulled out towards the channels, so the fish are going to follow those bait fish out. And I'm going to target those low tide fish with soft plastics most often. So I'm going to throw the heavy flipping setup, drop shot, Texas rig worm, or this flick shake, like I said, is really good. And it's nice because as that tide starts to drop out, you can throw this up into a current break and just barely move this worm, and it's a little bit tangled up there, but it'll almost just kind of hang in the current, and I mean it tends to really ignite those inactive fish. And this is something I'm going to use at a low tide for a search bait. I'm also going to throw a topwater, different things like a czar spook, depending on the water color, the weather of the day, if it's windy or whatever. But like I said, this bait is really going to work well for me at low tide. And I also tend to do better on the swim bait if I'm throwing it in open water on a low tide also. I think it gets the fish a little bit more conjugated around the structure. This is something I'm going to use at low tide. At high tide, I'm going to stick more with the rattle trap, things like that. To me, it seems like I can cover more water, and get a chance for the fish to see something moving fast when they're a little bit more active at the high tide. But something on the delta you got to keep in consideration, is a lot of those open water areas seem very blah. Just kind of, you look at Frank's track and you say, oh, it's just a big bowl. Well, if you really spend some time and fish those areas over and over through different tidal periods, through different seasons, you're going to notice areas where the grass grows early, where it dies off early, areas with hard bottom, areas with muck bottom. You're going to start to piece together the little different intricacies that are going to help you key in on fish. One of the things that I really like to do in those open water areas in the Delta is try to key in on the hard bottom areas. And you're really only going to find those areas by looking, over and over again, being in the same areas, be familiar with the water, knowing what's there and what's not. There's many areas that I fish there are little bitty spots within a big spot, and if you don't make the right cast, the right cast is important, and you need to know where those areas are. But again, a lot of times I found those fish for the first time throwing some sort of reaction bait like a rattle trap, catching a few fish off the same spot and then coming back to it later and remembering I caught fish there. And I've noticed that, after one day it'll be a low enough tide that I can see the bottom and see there's a mussel bed or something like that there. So that's really important. But the key is, in my opinion, to being versatile is, again, trying to have as many different baits available to you at that given time to where you can make a couple casts, try something else, make a couple casts. You'd be amazed that, because one day you might go out and really whack them on, say, a spinnerbait. The next day you won't get a bite on it, but you're going to keep throwing that spinnerbait. Most guys will because they've had such good success on it, the last trip out. You really need to keep an open mind, try to be as familiar with the different techniques as you can so that you can try something new, and that's the only way to build confidence in a new bait is trying new techniques. Another thing, it's just a subtle change can make a big difference. Some days I'll be throwing a swim bait, like I said, that little bit larger, bait I was throwing before, and maybe I'll be getting followers or something like that. That's the time to kind of clue yourself in. Try something a little bit smaller, maybe a little bit more subtle. This is one of the paddle tail baits. It's with a keel weighted hook, so it's got the weight down underneath the belly. Some days I'll notice that I'm getting followers on a different bait. I'll just try something new. Give it a half an hour, give it 15 minutes on a spot. Try something else. This again, I'll fish a lot like a spinnerbait or a crankbait. Just a slow roll retrieve generally works pretty well. It's got a little bit more of a tail motion, a little bit less of a profile. Sometimes the fish will get a little bit shy with a certain bait. But I think if you go out next time, you try to fish somewhere, maybe you're not really that familiar with the water, you really need to try to, set yourself up with a crankbait, a chatterbait, a swim bait, a flip bait, a couple small worms, and really just try to work each area with each bait just a little bit, and make 2 or 3 casts with one bait, pick up something else, make a few casts. Don't really try to change areas as much as change baits more often, and you'll find that throughout the day you'll start keying in on little subtleties that'll help you catch more fish. For your next trip, have a little bit more confidence in a new bait. Another bait that I want to show. Another bait that I want to show you that I think doesn't get used very often, which is partially why I think it tends to work a little bit better sometimes, is a wiggle wart. A lot of guys are familiar with wiggle warts for salmon and steelhead back trolling and whatnot, but these crankbaits have a really, really wide wobble, more so than almost any other crankbait that I throw. And it's just, again, it's a different look to the fish. It's got a different rattle, but it's really got a really erratic, wide wobble. A lot of times I'll go back through an area with kind of an obscure crankbait like this and find that for whatever reason the fish are really keen in on that. But again, I wouldn't have found these little subtleties had I not tried something different, on any given day. And I can probably count on my hands the amount of days that I've spent out there and just said, hey, I really think I should try something new. And just for that sake of making 2 or 3 casts with a bait that I don't have much confidence in, I've really found something great that I've gone back to over and over and over again. And this wiggle wart's one of those type of baits. They work really, really well for spotted bass for some reason, I've noticed too. I don't necessarily know why that is, but I've had a lot of success with the wiggle wart. And another bait that I think it's really hard to go without is a rip bait. Minnow style plug. This one's a Lucky Craft deep diving pointer, similar to the Lucky Craft Stacy, but this one's the actual pointer body with a deep diving bill. Again, this isn't the most popular rip bait out there. A lot of guys will throw a Pointer 100 or they'll throw Lucky Craft Stacy 90. It's a very popular deep diving rip bait. It's something that gets down a little bit farther. But I like to throw this one for a couple reasons. One, it's got a little bit more of a wobble, I think, than the Stacy does. The Stacy has a little bit more of a shimmy. This one's got a little bit heavier wobble. And it's also one of the baits that the fish don't see all that often. So if you're fishing in an area where a lot of other fishermen are, say Clear Lake's a really good example, late February, early March, a lot of guys are really keyed in on a rip bait bite. They'll all be throwing a lot of the similar baits, and I'll go back through and I'll throw this deep diving pointer and I'll fish it with the same cadence I would fish a shallow pointer. It's just getting down a few extra feet. But this bait is deadly. I've caught a lot of fish on this in the Delta. The only thing you have to be really concerned about on the Delta is that it is very shallow. So you really you can't just throw this bait haphazardly on the Delta. You're going to get caught up in the weeds a lot. I want to really key on the holes in the grass and on the grass lines themselves when I'm throwing this bait, because I know I need to have at least 3 or 4 or 5 feet to be able to work this bait effectively. In the colder water, I'm going to let it sit a little longer. I'm going to rip it, let it sit 5, 6, 7 seconds, rip it again. In warmer water, when the fish are really more active, I'm just going to give this a constant movement. Just keep this bait steadily moving down the bottom, and it's going to get fish to react to it. This is something that you're going to look for a reaction bite out of. But so basically, these are the baits that I'm going to have tied on a daily basis. I'm going to have probably 8 or 9 rods on my deck, a couple crankbait rods, a couple flipping rods, a couple light spinning rods, a spinner bait or a chatterbait, something like that. But again, try to remember to be versatile. The key to fishing is always learning. You're never going to know exactly what the fish are doing. You're never going to have them dialed in to the point where every cast you make, you're going to catch a fish. And the only way you're going to really learn new techniques and get confident in those new techniques is by trying them over and over again. The worst thing you can do is go out, in my opinion, with 1 bait, 2 baits, and just fish those baits all day. There is a school of thought out there, especially when guys talk about swim baits or slow presentations that, like dragging a jig in 60 foot of water, say. Yeah, you probably won't really learn how to do that technique unless you spend a lot of time. Those big swim baits are a great example of that too. You're not going to make 2 or 3 casts with a Huddleston bait and catch a 9-pounder. It's just not going to happen most often. You're going to need to spend some time doing it, but if you go at the same time, if you go out there and throw the same bait all day and catch 1 fish, the chances of you going out and really giving it an honest try the next time you're on the water is going to be that much less. So, in my opinion, go out with 5 or 6, 8 different rods, all tied up with different baits, so that you can just, spend 5 minutes fishing one, spend 5 minutes fishing another one, and then you'll catch fish on a technique, and then they'll kind of slow down, and you'll have to say, well, there's probably fish in this area, or I know they're biting a crankbait. When I go to my next spot, I'll try the crankbait, but if that doesn't work, I'll pick up a worm, or I'll pick up something else to give them a little bit different look. And you'd be surprised that you might go to one spot and you'll always catch them there on a crankbait, and you go to the next spot and you'll always catch them there on a worm. The reason you're going to learn that, though, is because you've thrown every other bait at that spot and not caught fish on everything else but this. And that's a great way to eliminate lures, for specific areas or specific times of year even. But you're only going to really learn those things by trial and error. And the best way to really give a good trial and error a go is by trying lots of different baits. Kind of a side note, when these chatterbaits first got popular a couple years ago, You know, everybody was, you know, they were really popular back east. Guys in Florida were catching them really well. You know, and then all of a sudden there was this big craze. Everybody had to have a chatterbait. So, you know, I had to go get a chatterbait, and I had to wait for one to get in. And nobody had them at the tackle shop. I'm thinking, oh man, I'm going to get one of these things. I'm just going to knock their socks off with it. You know, everybody's catching fish on it. Well, I think I caught a fish on it within the first 15 minutes of throwing it, and I didn't catch another fish for days throwing one of these things, because all I was doing was chucking and winding, reeling it in, casting, reeling it in, you know, and it wasn't working for me, so I put it down for a long time. And I spent about 2 or 3 months, when it probably would have been really productive, not throwing this bait. Well, then one day, I had a partner fishing with me, and he was throwing one, but he had a big trailer on it, and he was catching fish. And I tried mine, and I was trying mine, not getting bites, and finally decided to put a big trailer on it and started catching fish right away. Well, the big trailer doesn't work all the time, but that one specific incident gave me the confidence in this bait to know that I could catch, you know, that it worked for me as well as these other guys. And same goes for things like this heavy flipping. I mean, I could sit here and tell you how many giant fish I've caught doing this, and I mean, you probably wouldn't believe me. And I've gone behind guys catching fish on this, and part of it's because the guys that I'm fishing against don't have the confidence in this bait. Because the way it is now, I might fish in a tournament, say, I might spend 3 or 4 hours of my tournament day flipping for 4 or 5 bites, because I feel like those bites are going to be quality. You know, I expect to catch big fish on this bait. So I might spend 4 hours doing it, but the only way that I got the confidence to do that for 4 hours straight is by all the days that I've had good days, you know, all the days that I've realized how many fish I can catch on a bait like this, you know, and it just takes that time on the water confidence to really build yourself up. But at the same time, you know, a bait like this little flick shake worm or a drop shot or a shaky head, chances are you're going to catch fish on this right out of the box. I mean, if you go to an area, say like Clear Lake in the summertime, I don't know if many of you are familiar with fishing Clear Lake in June, July, and August, but the fishing there, at least the last few years, has been phenomenal. You can catch, you know, 50, 80, 100 fish days on little worms and jigs, where it is almost every single cast. There's so many fish up shallow. So, you know, on a day like that, you don't necessarily have to go to something like this because you're going to catch a lot of fish. But baits like this, on average, are going to catch a lot of fish, and you just have to realize that by trial and error. And the areas on like the Delta, Shasta, places that the fish tend to bite pretty frequently, you know, go out and try one of these little flick shake worms or a little shaky head, and you'd be amazed at how many fish you catch on it. But again, you know, it all takes confidence, and it might take you a little while, but if you just want to go out and catch fish, I recommend throwing around the little plastic worms, the little drop shots, the weightless Senkos, things like that, because those are going to catch inactive and active. Fish that are feeding are going to be happily eating worms. You know, fish that are inactive, you're still going to get them to bite. You know, if you want to, if you don't have a lot of confidence in a bait like a swim bait, like I said, you know, just throughout your day, try to work it in a little bit more often. Try different techniques and things with it, but don't burn yourself out on it, because chances are the next fishing, you're not going to want to throw the bait you never got bit on the last trip out. But as you start to experiment and as you start to progress as a fisherman, getting familiar with more and more techniques, all these baits will soon find a place in your arsenal, and you'll start to realize when some are more productive than others. But the only way, like I say, you're going to do that is by trial and error, you know, throwing different lures at the same areas, same targets, and we're catching fish on them. So hopefully this, you know, was a little bit helpful to you. If you have any questions, I'm more than happy to talk. You know, I had a whole nother idea on a seminar, but couldn't really work them both in together. But the tides in the Delta, I have a lot of really strong opinions on that. I've written a couple articles for Bass West Magazine that I've gotten a lot of feedback on. It seems like they've been popular articles. I get email almost daily about them. And so if any of you guys have any questions about that article, feel free to talk to me down here. If not, hopefully next time, go fishing, just, you know, try 7 or 8 different baits throughout the day and just keep rotating, and I guarantee you'll figure out how 1 or 2 of them catches fish for you. So enjoy the rest of the show. So the chatterbait.